So as promised, this will be our follow-up to what we did in class today, focusing on political parties in Mexico. So let's start here. We didn't talk about the role of the military, but this is something that every once in a while does come up on the AP exam. So I want to make sure you have a little bit of information on the role of the military in Mexico. This comes right after the judiciary slide. So what's important about the role of the military in Mexico, it differs from the military in China. The military is directly under the control of the party. This is not the case in Mexico. It's under civilian control, so it's separate from the centers of political power, which is the same way it works in the United States. This just means that it's it's under the control of a commander-in-chief, but it's not directly run by, a government, like a dictator within the government, or by a party. The military has been used for a variety of tasks. Things that might come up that you might see on the test would be something like it's being used to combat drug trafficking with varying roles of success. In the 60s, it was used to put down student protests. Since then, and in the other video that you'll see, the military and the government has responded much more favorably to student protests. Sometimes the military is used to deal with a crisis, like an earthquake or a labor strike or something similar to what we might see, especially dealing with an earthquake or another natural disaster. That'd be similar to what we would see the military doing in the United States. I'm going to ask my Mexico folks to take a look at some of these issues, especially in the 90s, if you wanted to include the role of the military in getting involved with the police in Mexico City, or their role, their pretty repressive role in the 70s and 80s. That'd be something you could look at as a policy issue. But just in general, you need to know that the military is under civilian control and that they're used to break labor strikes, sometimes suppress protests, respond to natural disasters, and so forth. Okay, political parties, and this is updated. I do have information on our current the current president's political party. So typically these have been the three major parties, the PRI, PRD, and PAN. So let's look at those, and then I'll throw in Morena, which is the current president's party. You'll notice that this is the current president here, Andres Manuel López Obrador, who left PRD and founded Morena and then won for the first time in that platform. So Mexico is a multi-party system really since 2000, when the end of pre-party domination ended. The three parties are PRI, PAN, and PRD. Let's start with PRI. So it stands for the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI party for short. And when it was created, it was a coalition of elites. So remember that the PRI party was founded in the 20s, and it came out of some remnants of the revolution and civil war that occurred from about 1910 until 1917. So we do have some elements of certain factions from the revolution at play here. So namely, some of the values that they held were land reform, empowerment of peasants. They wanted to make sure that laborers, peasants, and bureaucrats could all work together. They ruled as a one-party system until 2000. From 2000 to 2012, they lost the presidency, but then in 2012, Peña Nieto was reelected. And so Peña Nieto, and I'll ask my Mexico groups to touch on this too, he won the presidency with about 33% of the vote. He was very unpopular by the time he left office, and a couple of reasons for that were he was seen as pretty weak in responding to President Trump and President Trump's rhetoric about Mexico building the wall. There's also a pretty horrific event where 43 students disappeared from a teachers' college in Mexico, and the presumption is that they were murdered, and Nieto did not do enough to deal with this. There's been very little government response to that event, so he faced a lot of criticism for that and lost favorability, which is why Obrador and the Morena party were extremely popular and were polling way ahead of the other parties in the election. So the PRI party, as we've talked about, historically has employed a corporatist structure where they give out favors in return for political support, and they did initially bring competing elites into their cabinets. And that goes along with that clientelism, patron-client system. You give us support, we'll give you resources. And it appeals to rural people, people in the South, people who are a little bit less educated, people who are older or poor tend to respond to the pre-party. So the typical voter for this party would be from a rural area or small town. They might have less education than voters for other parties. So really, this is really a central party. This party tends to be labeled as a little bit to the left maybe, but really they're really more of a centralized party. To the right of PRI would be PAN, which is the National Action Party. So they're just to the right. Again, it's fairly centrist. This party was created to represent business interests, so you'll see some perhaps some similarities here with the Republican Party. So they advocate regional autonomy. They want less government intervention in the economy, whereas the pre-party would be more in favor of some government intervention. They have a good rapport with the Catholic Church, and their strength is really held in northern Mexico, whereas pre-party is a little bit more favorable in some of the more rural areas and the areas in the south. The PAN party has more strength in the north, and they tend to also appeal to urban voters. So that's I think interesting here is that here's a difference between this party that leans a little bit to the right. In the United States, obviously Republicans to the right typically appeal to more rural voters, and yet PRI tends to be the party that appeals to more rural voters, where this party with the business party, leads toward more urban voters. And I think that makes sense considering the fact that business has really developed in the urban areas. And so those with higher levels of education and religious people as well tend to vote with this party. They won a few governor's races in the 1990s, but really had little impact prior to then and shortly after that as well. The other major party is the party to PRI's left. So again, PRI, kind of the center point. PRD would be slightly to the left. This is where Obrador began and then spun off and formed his own party. So the Democratic Revolutionary Party, you don't need to know these longer names, by the way. You're not going to be asked to identify them that way. Just know PRD, PAN, and PRI. So they split off initially from the PRI party. They were one and the same. They suffered from internal division, a lack of focus. They have failed to win the presidency. They've been focused more on reform and social justice. And so then I think there were even more internal fractures, which caused Obrador to split. They appeal to people who are younger, very politically active, fighting for social justice, people who have some level of education, not necessarily higher education. This is kind of the more central part of the country. In 2006, they were able to draw some middle class and older voters, but typically they get their support from younger members. And then finally, I'm going to put this up for you guys because even just a simple Wikipedia description of this new party I think will be really helpful to you. And you've read a little bit about AMLO and what he stands for, but his party is called the National Regeneration Movement, or it's known as Morena. They won the presidency by forming a coalition with two other parties, and they also won a majority in both the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies in this past election in 2018. So they're a much more left-wing party, and their focus is on ethnic, religious, cultural, sexual diversity, respect for human rights, respect for the environment. The ideology page was extensive, even just here, so I'm going to put the notes up, and if you guys can go take a look at that and just kind of see what they're about, I think that would be really helpful to you. This is just the gist of what's going on with this new party. This is really important, the electoral reforms. I would not be shocked if you were asked on the exam to give some examples of reforms that have happened. One of them would be what we've talked about in class, which is the quota system for women on the ballot. And actually, I said it was 40%, but candidates have to run 40% of women on the ballot. It's actually 50%. That was changed in 2014. So in 1990, they created an electoral commission to regulate campaigns. Prior to this, the pre-party just simply ran all the elections and made all the decisions. So this independent commission is incredibly important. So what they guarantee is that all parties have to get government funding. They all have to have access to media. They increased the number of Senate seats from 68 to 128, so it's increasing representation in the upper house. Foreign electoral observers. This is really interesting. In 1994, what this means is that people from outside the country can actually have a role in overseeing the election to make sure that the process is running smoothly and in a democratic fashion. In 1996, the commission, so this initial commission, was revised to form the Federal Electoral Commission that's even stronger than the initial commission, and their rules, they create all the rules for all elections, and what they institute is binding. They also created a limit for how many seats one party can hold in the Chamber of Deputies. So you can see here that Mexico is really trying to get away from that system of one-party rule. We may look at this and think, how undemocratic. You know, if one party can get elected and hold all the seats, why shouldn't they be entitled to do that? And that's a valid point, and I think that that's something maybe we can talk about in class. I think the reason behind this is because for so many years, electoral competition was non-existent. So they're really trying to get away from that to create true choice and to make sure there is diversity and representation. So one party can only hold 60% of the seats. And think about it, guys. That still means that you're going to have the majority here to get votes through, but you can't go above that. So I'd be interested to know on your thoughts on that one as well. Additional reforms. I talked about this in class a little bit. 32 of the 128 seats in the Senate are awarded proportionally, so that also increases party representation in the Senate. There are campaign limits on spending, a threshold for participation in proportional representation. So meaning for all those seats that are awarded based on the proportional system, a party has to get at least 2% of the vote to win any seats. Priests were allowed to vote. So this is a reaction, this goes against what was established in the Constitution of 1917. It takes away some of that anti-clericalism that we saw a little bit earlier. And this has since changed. So now in 2014, the gender quota is in place for candidate lists. And I looked into this a whole bunch, and it appears that that's just for the legislature. That doesn't exist for races at the local level or for like a governor's seat or for the presidency, for instance. It's really just for representation. Okay, so we went through that. So I really, really, again, encourage you, make sure you can list some of these electoral reforms if you were to see that. I'm almost positive that I'll put that on your test, so just make sure you're aware of those. Okay, this is, I actually need to update this because as of the current election, Mexico has bumped up to the 4th spot in terms of number of seats in parliament. This is what I saw that had the United States way up here in, like, I don't know what number that is, 20th or so. We looked this up in first period today, and the United States was actually number 78 currently. So the United States has moved down, and Mexico has moved up to number 4. Let me link that for you guys in the notes as well, since this is not new. The media, this is really the last thing. So the media was pretty government run under pre-party rule. It became much more independent in the 80s as people, they got access to satellite television. It's great. And it's much more open today, although Mexico is a dangerous place to be a journalist, more so because of drug cartel rule as opposed to the government. So as you guys are researching drug cartels, if you can find anything on that, that would be really helpful, because if journalists report on activity and behaviors of the government being corrupt or influenced by drug cartels, or if they report on drug cartel activity, they can be threatened. There have been a number of newspapers, many newspapers that have had to shut down in response to cartel activity. Social media is even very dangerous, like common citizens who post about drug cartel activity on social media face threats from the cartels. So that's really, really problematic in terms of media. So government says, yep, media is open, but the cartel has forced the shutdown of some papers because you can't be too critical of their activities. All right, we will wrap it up there.